The sledgehammer hit the false wall with a hollow thud that echoed through the abandoned haunted house attraction. Construction worker Miguel Santos paused, wiping sweat from his brow in the stifling August heat of 2024. Something about the sound wasn't right. After 23 years in demolition, he knew the difference between solid drywall and empty space. He struck again, harder this time, and felt the wall give way slightly. Through the crack, a musty smell escaped. Not the typical mildew of an old building, but something else. Something that made his stomach turn. Behind that wall, in what should have been solid concrete foundation, was a hidden room. And scattered across its floor were the remnants of a birthday party that had been frozen in time for 34 years. Deflated balloons, a child's sneaker, and a cake server with "Happy 8th Birthday, Sarah" engraved on its silver handle. Detective Lieutenant Rachel Morrison received the call at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday that would change her life forever. She'd been assigned to the Arlington Police Department's cold case unit for 3 years, but nothing had prepared her for what she'd find beneath the Haunted Mansion attraction at the defunct Six Flags Over Texas location in Grand Prairie. The theme park had closed its doors permanently in 2019, leaving behind a graveyard of rusted rides and decaying attractions that had become a magnet for urban explorers and demolition crews tasked with clearing the land for redevelopment. Morrison arrived at the scene 47 minutes after Santos made his discovery. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked asphalt parking lot, where yellow police tape now fluttered in the hot Texas wind. She could see the outline of the old log flume ride in the distance, its tracks twisted and broken like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast. The haunted house stood at the edge of what had once been the park's main thoroughfare, its facade still bearing the faded paint of grinning skulls and ghoulish faces that had once delighted visitors. "What do we have?" Morrison asked Sergeant Tom Valdez, who'd been first on scene after Santos called 911. Valdez was a 20-year veteran with graying temples and the steady demeanor of someone who'd seen too much to be easily shaken. But today, his usual composure seemed strained. "Construction crew found a hidden room behind a false wall in the basement level," Valdez said, consulting his notepad. "Looks like someone walled it up deliberately. Well, you need to see it yourself." They descended a narrow staircase into the bowels of the attraction. The basement had originally housed the ride's mechanical systems and control panels, but years of neglect had turned it into a maze of rusted pipes and moldering electrical equipment. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on the concrete walls, and Morrison could hear the steady drip of water from a broken pipe somewhere in the darkness. The hidden room was approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, with concrete walls and no windows. Crime scene photographer Janet Kim was already documenting the space, her camera flash illuminating the scene in stark, white bursts. Morrison stepped carefully around the evidence markers, taking in the details that would haunt her for months to come. The birthday party debris was arranged as if the celebration had been interrupted mid-event. Paper plates were scattered across the floor, some still bearing traces of chocolate cake. A deflated happy birthday balloon hung from a nail driven into the concrete wall. Children's toys lay scattered about. A small plastic dinosaur, a jump rope with pink handles, and what appeared to be party favor bags with their contents spilled out. But it was the photographs that made Morrison's blood run cold. Dozens of them, pinned to the walls with thumbtacks, showed children at various birthday parties. Some were clearly taken at the theme park, with the distinctive Six Flags rides visible in the background. Others seemed to be from private homes or community centers. The children in the photos ranged in age from perhaps 5 to 10 years old, all smiling and laughing, unaware that their joyful moments were being captured by someone with sinister intentions. "Have we identified any of the children in these photos?" Morrison asked Kim, who was carefully documenting each image. "Working on it. Some of these look like they could be from the late 80s or early 90s, based on the clothing and hairstyles. The photo quality suggests they were taken with a decent camera, not just snapshots." Morrison examined the cake server more closely. The engraving was professional, the kind of work done by a jewelry store or gift shop. "Happy 8th Birthday, Sarah" was etched in elegant script with a small flower design bordering the text. This wasn't a random piece of party equipment. It was personal, meaningful. Someone had cared enough about Sarah to have it specially made. "We need to run this through missing persons databases," Morrison said. "Start with 1990 and work backwards. Focus on children named Sarah, ages 7 to 9, who disappeared in the Dallas-Fort Worth area." The forensics team worked methodically through the afternoon, cataloging every piece of evidence. They found more than party supplies in that hidden room. Beneath a loose floorboard, wrapped in plastic, were detailed notes written in a careful, cramped handwriting. The pages contained what appeared to be surveillance logs, documenting the movements and habits of various families who had visited the theme park. Names, addresses, phone numbers, and disturbingly personal details about children's schedules and preferences. One entry, dated June 15, 1990, caught Morrison's attention. Sarah W., 1247 Elm Street, Dallas. Birthday party scheduled for Saturday, 2 p.m. Mother works at First National Bank. Father travels for insurance company. Usually arrives at park around noon. Stays until closing. Favorite ride is the carousel. Afraid of loud noises. Morrison felt a chill despite the stifling heat. This wasn't random. It was methodical, calculated. Someone had been watching these families, studying them, preparing for something terrible. The investigation officially began the next morning. Morrison's team included Detective Paul Reeves, a specialist in crimes against children, and Detective Maria Santos, who had joined the department 5 years earlier after a distinguished career with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Together, they began the painstaking process of building a timeline and identifying potential victims. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Eleanor Whitman, a retired pediatrician who had volunteered at the theme park's first aid station during the late 1980s and early 1990s, called the police tip line after seeing the news coverage of the discovery. Her voice was shaky but determined as she spoke to Morrison. "I remember Sarah Williams," Dr. Whitman said. "She was 8 years old, blonde hair, gap-toothed smile. Her family had a birthday party at the park on June 16, 1990. I treated her for a scraped knee earlier that day. She'd fallen off her bike in the parking lot. Sweet little girl. Her parents were Tom and Linda Williams." Morrison's pulse quickened. "What else do you remember about that day?" "It was busy, as Saturdays always were, but I remember the party because they had reserved one of the pavilions near the haunted house. There were maybe 10 or 12 children there, all around the same age. The parents seemed nice, normal. Nothing stood out as unusual until..." "Until what?" "Well, I saw the family again around 4 o'clock. They were near the park entrance, talking to security. The mother was crying, and the father looked frantic. I asked if I could help, and they told me Sarah had wandered off. They'd been looking for her for over an hour." Morrison made rapid notes. "Did they find her?" "That's just it. I don't know. My shift ended at 5, and I never heard what happened. I assumed they'd found her and taken her home. It wasn't until I saw the news report that I realized, oh my God, what if they never found her?" The next phase of the investigation involved tracking down the Williams family. Tom Williams had died in a car accident in 2003, but Linda Williams, now Linda Martinez after remarrying, was living in San Antonio. Morrison and Reeves made the drive south on a scorching Thursday morning, the endless Texas highway stretching before them like a ribbon of heat-warped asphalt. Linda Martinez was 64 years old now. Her blonde hair turned silver, but her eyes still held the haunted look of a mother who had lost a child. She lived in a modest ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood, and when she opened the door and saw the police badges, Morrison watched 34 years of carefully constructed emotional walls crumble in an instant. "You found something," Linda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About Sarah." They sat in her living room, surrounded by photographs that documented a life lived in the shadow of loss. Pictures of Sarah at various ages covered the mantelpiece, school photos, birthday parties, family vacations. But they all stopped at age 8, frozen in time like exhibits in a museum of grief. "Tell us about the day she disappeared," Morrison said gently. "Take your time." Linda's hands shook as she reached for a tissue. It was supposed to be perfect. Sarah had been looking forward to her birthday party for weeks. She'd invited her whole class, and we'd saved up to rent the pavilion and buy all the decorations. Tom was so proud. He'd arranged to take the weekend off from work, which was rare for him. The story that emerged was both heartbreaking and infuriating. The Williams family had arrived at the park at 11:30 a.m., just as planned. They'd set up the pavilion with balloons and streamers, arranged the party favors, and welcomed the arriving children and their parents. Sarah had been radiant, Morrison learned, wearing a new pink dress with white flowers that Linda had sewn herself. The party was going wonderfully, Linda continued. Sarah opened her presents, we sang Happy Birthday, and she made a wish before blowing out the candles. I can still see her face in that moment, pure joy. Then the children wanted to go on rides, so we all went together. The parents took turns supervising different groups. At approximately 2:45 p.m., according to Linda's recollection, Sarah had asked to go to the bathroom. The nearest restroom was located near the haunted house attraction, about 100 yards from where the group was gathered near the carousel. Linda had been helping another child who had gotten sick from too much cotton candy, so she'd asked Sarah to wait a few minutes. But Sarah was impatient, the way 8-year-olds are, Linda said, her voice breaking. She said she could go by herself, that she was a big girl now. The bathroom was so close, and there were so many people around. I thought it would be okay. Sarah never returned. When Linda realized she'd been gone too long, she'd enlisted the help of other parents to search the immediate area. They'd checked the bathroom, the nearby food stands, and all of Sarah's favorite rides. As the minutes turned into an hour, panic had set in. Park security was called, then the police. The search had been extensive, but ultimately futile. More than 200 people, including police officers, park employees, and volunteers, had combed every inch of the theme park. Bloodhounds had been brought in, but they'd lost Sarah's scent near the haunted house. The search had continued for 3 days, expanding to include the surrounding neighborhoods and countryside, but no trace of the little girl was ever found. The police said she'd probably been taken by someone who knew the park well, Linda said. Someone who could have gotten her out quickly without being seen. But there were no witnesses, no surveillance cameras in that area. It was like she'd just vanished. Morrison felt the familiar weight of a cold case settling on her shoulders. She'd worked dozens of missing persons cases over the years, but there was something particularly cruel about child abductions. The families never stopped hoping, never stopped searching, never stopped blaming themselves for that one moment of inattention that changed everything. Mrs. Martinez, Morrison said carefully, we found some evidence that suggests Sarah may have been taken by someone who had been watching your family. Did you notice anyone following you or paying unusual attention to Sarah in the weeks before her disappearance? Linda's eyes widened. Watching us? I don't know. Maybe. There was this man. What man? At the grocery store, about a week before the party. Sarah and I were shopping for party supplies, and I noticed this man in the next aisle. He seemed to be listening to our conversation, and when Sarah ran ahead to look at the balloons, he followed her. I called her back, and when I looked around, he was gone. Morrison leaned forward. Can you describe him? Average height, maybe 5'9" or 10. Brown hair, clean-shaven. He was wearing a blue work shirt and jeans. Nothing particularly distinctive except what? He had a camera hanging around his neck. One of those expensive ones with the big lens. I thought it was odd for someone to have a camera in a grocery store. The details sent a chill through Morrison. The photographs in the hidden room had been taken with a high-quality camera, the kind used by serious photographers or professionals. She made a note to have the crime scene photos analyzed by the FBI's Photographic Analysis Unit. Back in Arlington, the investigation was gaining momentum. Detective Santos had been working with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to identify other potential victims from the photographs found in the hidden room. The process was painstaking. Many of the children in the photos were now adults, if they were still alive, and facial recognition technology could only do so much with decades-old images. But patterns were beginning to emerge. At least 8 of the children in the photographs had been reported missing from the Dallas-Fort Worth area between 1988 and 1992. All were between the ages of 6 and 10, all had blonde or light brown hair, and all had disappeared from public places during weekend family outings. The most disturbing discovery came from Detective Reeves' analysis of the surveillance notes. The unknown suspect had been documenting these families' routines for months, sometimes years, before the children disappeared. He knew their schedules, their favorite restaurants, their children's schools and activities. He had been patient, methodical, and terrifyingly organized. This wasn't opportunistic, Reeves told Morrison during their daily briefing. This was planned, systematic. Our suspect was a predator who specifically targeted families with young children, and he used Six Flags as his hunting ground. Morrison studied the evidence board they'd constructed in the cold case unit's conference room. Photos, timelines, and witness statements covered every inch of the whiteboard, connected by red string that looked like a spider's web of tragedy. At the center of it all was the image of Sarah Williams, her gap-toothed smile frozen in time. "We need to focus on employees," Morrison said. "Someone who worked at the park or had regular access to it." The hidden room was professionally constructed. Whoever built it knew the building's layout and had access to construction materials. And the location is perfect for someone who needed to move undetected. The employee records from Six Flags Over Texas in 1990 filled 3 bankers' boxes. The park had employed over 800 people during the summer season, from ride operators to janitors to food service workers. Many of the employment records were incomplete. This was before computerized databases and background checks were routine. But Morrison's team began the tedious process of cross-referencing names with criminal records, driver's licenses, and known addresses. The breakthrough came on a humid Friday afternoon in September. Detective Santos had been working her way through the maintenance department employee records when she found a name that made her pulse quicken. David Allen Kovac, age 27 in 1990, hired as a general maintenance worker in March of that year. Kovac's employment record showed several concerning details. He'd been hired without a background check, which wasn't unusual for the time but would have revealed a disturbing pattern. He'd worked at 3 other theme parks in Texas and Oklahoma between 1985 and 1989, leaving each job after complaints about inappropriate behavior around children. He'd been fired from Six Flags in November 1990, just 5 months after Sarah's disappearance, for policy violations that weren't specified in the file. More importantly, Kovac had been assigned to the maintenance crew responsible for the haunted house attraction. He would have had keys to all areas of the building, including the basement where the hidden room was located. He would have known the building's layout intimately, and he would have had access to the tools and materials needed to construct the false wall. "We need to find this guy," Morrison said, but Detective Santos was already shaking her head. "I ran his name through the system," Santos said. David Allen Kovac died in 1998 in a single-car accident outside of Oklahoma City. "But, Lieutenant, there's something else. I found his last known address and contacted the Oklahoma County Sheriff's Office. They searched his property after he died. He was a suspect in several child abduction cases there." Morrison felt a familiar mixture of excitement and frustration. They were getting closer to the truth, but their primary suspect was beyond justice. What did they find? Photographs, hundreds of them, all of children. The detective I spoke with said they were organized by location and date, going back to the mid-1980s. And Lieutenant, some of them were taken at Six Flags Over Texas. The Oklahoma County Sheriff's Office had been generous with their files, sending everything they had on David Allen Kovac via secure email. Morrison spent the weekend reviewing the case files, and what she found painted a picture of a man who had spent his adult life hunting children. Kovac had been born in 1963 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the youngest of 3 children. His father had worked construction jobs throughout the Southwest, and the family had moved frequently during Kovac's childhood. School records showed he'd been an average student but had difficulty forming friendships and showed signs of what teachers described as, quote, unusual interests. At age 16, Kovac had been arrested for taking photographs of children at a public pool. The charges were dropped when the families involved declined to press charges, but the incident established a pattern that would follow him for the rest of his life. He'd drifted from job to job, always seeking employment that would give him access to children, youth camps, amusement parks, school districts. The photographs found in his Oklahoma home were meticulously organized. Each child had their own file, complete with personal information, family details, and surveillance notes. The Oklahoma detective who had worked the case, Lieutenant James Morrison, no relation to Rachel, had provided detailed analysis of Kovac's methods. He was patient, James Morrison had written in his report. He would spend months, sometimes years, studying a potential victim before making his move. He preferred children from middle-class families who visited public venues regularly. He was particularly drawn to birthday parties and family celebrations, possibly because the children were more relaxed and less supervised. The most chilling discovery was a journal found in Kovac's home. Written in the same careful handwriting as the surveillance notes found in the hidden room, it detailed his thoughts and fantasies about the children he was watching. The entries were clinical, detached, and deeply disturbing. One entry, dated July 4, 1990, just weeks after Sarah's disappearance, read, "The Williams girl was perfect, young enough to be trusting, old enough to remember. The family will spend the rest of their lives wondering, searching, hoping." That's the real beauty of it. The knowledge that they'll never know what happened, never find closure, never be able to move on. The child is gone, but the suffering continues forever. Morrison had to stop reading. She walked to the window of her office, looking out at the parking lot, where normal people were going about their normal lives, unaware of the darkness that existed just beneath the surface of their world. She thought about Linda Martinez, about the wall of photographs in her living room, about 34 years of wondering and hoping and grieving. The investigation into David Allen Kovac's activities at Six Flags Over Texas revealed the scope of his crimes. Working with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, Morrison's team determined that Kovac had likely been responsible for at least 12 child abductions in the Dallas-Fort Worth area between 1988 and 1992. The hidden room had been his trophy case, a place where he could revisit his crimes and plan new ones. But knowing who was responsible didn't answer the most important question. What had happened to Sarah Williams and the other children? The Oklahoma authorities had found no evidence of the victims in Kovac's home or on his property. It was possible that he'd killed them and disposed of their bodies, but it was also possible that he'd sold them to others or transported them far from the area. Morrison decided to take a different approach. Instead of focusing on Kovac, she would focus on the victims. Using the photographs and surveillance notes found in the hidden room, she began the process of identifying and contacting the families of the missing children. The first call was to Robert Chen, whose 7-year-old daughter Amy had disappeared from Six Flags on September 2, 1989. Chen was now 58 years old, living in Houston with his second wife. When Morrison explained why she was calling, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "You found something," Chen said finally. "About Amy. We found evidence that suggests your daughter was taken by someone who had been watching your family," Morrison said. "I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions about the day she disappeared." Chen's story was remarkably similar to the Williams family's experience. Amy had been at the park for a friend's birthday party when she'd asked to use the restroom. She'd been gone for less than 10 minutes when the other children realized she was missing. The search had been immediate and thorough, but no trace of Amy was ever found. The police said she'd probably been taken by someone who knew the park, Chen said. Someone who could have gotten her out quickly. But there were no witnesses, no leads. It was like she just vanished. Morrison made the same call to 6 other families over the next 2 weeks. Each conversation was heartbreaking, but also revealing. The pattern was consistent. Children disappearing from busy public areas, always near the haunted house attraction, always during peak hours when the park was crowded and chaotic. The families had all been devastated by their losses, but they'd also been resilient. Some had divorced, unable to cope with the strain of losing a child. Others had grown closer, united by their shared grief. Several had become advocates for missing children, working with organizations like the National Center for Missing and exploited children to help other families facing similar tragedies. One family, the Johnsons, had never given up hope that their daughter might still be alive. 8-year-old Rebecca Johnson had disappeared from Six Flags on July 14, 1990, just 1 month after Sarah Williams. Her parents, Mark and Susan Johnson, had spent their life savings on private investigators and continued to receive tips and leads even decades after their daughter's disappearance. "We've never stopped looking," Susan Johnson told Morrison during their phone conversation. "We've followed leads to Mexico, to California, to Florida. Most of them turned out to be false hopes, but we couldn't give up. Rebecca would be 42 years old now. She might have children of her own." We just need to know what happened to her. Morrison felt the weight of these families' hopes and expectations. They deserved answers, deserved justice, deserved to know the truth about what had happened to their children. But David Allen Kovac was dead, and the evidence trail was decades old. The chances of finding the missing children, or even their remains, seemed increasingly slim. The next breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Sarah Goldstein, a forensic anthropologist at the University of Texas at Dallas, had been following the case through news reports and had contacted Morrison with an offer to help analyze the physical evidence from the hidden room. "I specialize in cases involving missing children," Dr. Goldstein explained during their meeting. "I've worked with law enforcement agencies across the country to identify remains and reconstruct crime scenes. What you found is unique. A preserved crime scene that hasn't been disturbed for more than 3 decades. Dr. Goldstein's analysis of the evidence was methodical and revealing. The party supplies found in the hidden room had been arranged deliberately, she determined, not scattered randomly. The placement suggested that Kovac had been recreating the birthday party experience, possibly as a way to relive the abduction. More importantly, Dr. Goldstein's team had found trace evidence that the police crime scene unit had missed. Using advanced DNA analysis techniques that hadn't been available in 1990, they were able to extract genetic material from several items in the room. The DNA belonged to at least 4 different children, all female, all between the ages of 6 and 10. This room wasn't just a trophy case, Dr. Goldstein told Morrison. It was a holding area. The children were brought here after they were abducted, probably while Kovac decided what to do with them. The DNA evidence suggests they were here for extended periods, hours, possibly days. The revelation was both encouraging and terrifying. If the children had been held in the hidden room for extended periods, it was possible that some of them had survived their initial abduction, but it also meant that their final fate was even more uncertain. Morrison decided to expand the investigation beyond the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Working with the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, she began searching for similar cases in other states where Kovac had worked. The results were disturbing but not surprising. Between 1985 and 1998, David Allen Kovac had worked at theme parks, water parks, and family entertainment centers in Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, and Louisiana. In each location, there had been reports of missing children that fit the same pattern. Young girls, ages 6 to 10, disappearing from crowded public venues during family outings. The scope of Kovac's crimes was staggering. Conservative estimates suggested he'd been responsible for the abductions of at least 25 children over 13 years. But the true number might have been much higher, as many cases from the 1980s and early 1990s had been poorly documented or investigated. Working with law enforcement agencies in 4 states, Morrison began the process of reopening cold cases that might be connected to Kovac's activities. The work was painstaking and often frustrating, as many of the original case files had been lost or destroyed, and witnesses had died or moved away. But slowly, a picture emerged of a predator who had perfected his methods over more than a decade. Kovac had been careful, patient, and methodical. He'd studied law enforcement techniques and learned from his mistakes. He'd moved frequently, never staying in one location long enough to establish a clear pattern that might have led to his capture. The most promising lead came from Little Rock, Arkansas, where Kovac had worked at a water park called Splash World during the summer of 1994. Detective Ray Williams, no relation to Sarah Williams, had been investigating the disappearance of 6-year-old Emma Rodriguez when he'd first encountered Kovac's name. He was questioned as a routine matter, Detective Williams told Morrison during their phone conversation. All the park employees were interviewed, and Kovac didn't stand out as particularly suspicious. He was polite, cooperative, seemed genuinely concerned about the missing girl. But there was something about him that bothered me. What was that? He knew too much. When I asked him about his whereabouts on the day Emma disappeared, he had a detailed timeline that seemed almost rehearsed. He remembered exactly where he'd been working, what time he'd taken his breaks, who he'd talked to. Most people can't recall that level of detail about a routine workday. But Kovac had it all memorized. Emma Rodriguez had never been found, but Detective Williams had kept the case file active and had continued to investigate leads over the years. When Morrison shared the information about Kovac's activities at Six Flags Over Texas, Williams realized that he'd been dealing with the same perpetrator. "The thing is," Williams said, I think Emma might still be alive. We had a tip about 2 years ago from a woman in Houston who claimed to have information about a child trafficking ring that was active in the 1990s. She said she'd been forced to participate when she was a teenager, and she remembered a man who brought young girls to a house in East Texas. Her description of the man matched Kovac. Morrison felt a surge of hope mixed with dread. If some of Kovac's victims had been sold into trafficking rather than murdered, it was possible that they were still alive, still suffering, still waiting for rescue. But it also meant that the investigation would become exponentially more complex and dangerous. The tip that Detective Williams had received led Morrison to Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a clinical psychologist who specialized in treating survivors of human trafficking. Dr. Hendricks had been working with the Houston woman, whose name was protected by confidentiality agreements, to help her recover memories of her traumatic experiences. "I can't share specific details about my patient," Dr. Hendricks told Morrison during their meeting, "but I can tell you that there was definitely a trafficking network operating in East Texas during the 1990s. Children were bought and sold like commodities, often to buyers in other states or countries. The victims were kept in various locations, houses, trailers, even underground bunkers, until they could be transported." The revelation opened up new possibilities but also new challenges. Human trafficking cases were notoriously difficult to investigate, especially when the crimes had occurred decades earlier. The victims were often too traumatized to testify, the perpetrators had usually covered their tracks carefully, and the evidence was often circumstantial. But Morrison was determined to follow every lead. Working with the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force, she began investigating the network that might have purchased children from David Allen Kovac. The work was slow and often dangerous, as many of the people involved in trafficking were still active criminals with violent backgrounds. The first breakthrough came from financial records that the FBI had obtained through a search warrant. Kovac's bank records showed regular deposits of large amounts of cash throughout the 1990s, far more than his theme park salary would have justified. The deposits were typically made within a few days of reported child abductions, suggesting that he'd been paid for each victim he provided. More telling were the travel records. Kovac had made regular trips to East Texas, usually staying for just 1 or 2 days at a time. The trips corresponded with the timing of several child abductions, suggesting that he'd been delivering victims to buyers in the area. Using cell phone records and credit card transactions, the FBI was able to track Kovac's movements to a rural area near Marshall, Texas, about 150 miles east of Dallas. The area was remote, sparsely populated, and had been home to several criminal enterprises over the years. Local law enforcement in Marshall was familiar with the area's history. Sheriff's Deputy Mike Rodriguez had been investigating reports of suspicious activity in the region for years, but the cases had been difficult to pursue due to lack of evidence and witness cooperation. "There's been rumors about that area for as long as I've been working here," Deputy Rodriguez told Morrison. "People would see convoys of cars coming and going at odd hours. Strangers who didn't seem to have any legitimate business in the area. We investigated several times, but we never found anything concrete." The property in question was a 200-acre ranch that had been owned by a man named William Billy Garrett. Garrett had died in 2001, and the property had been sold to a development company that planned to build a residential subdivision. But the development had been delayed by environmental concerns, and the land remained largely undisturbed. Morrison obtained a search warrant for the property and assembled a team that included FBI agents, local law enforcement, and forensic specialists. The search began on a cool October morning, with teams of investigators methodically combing through the overgrown fields and abandoned buildings. The main house had been demolished years earlier, but the foundation remained, along with several outbuildings and a network of underground structures that had once been used for storm shelters. It was in one of these underground rooms that the search team made their most significant discovery. The room was approximately 12 feet by 15 feet, with concrete walls and a heavy steel door. Inside, they found evidence that children had been held there for extended periods. Mattresses, children's clothing, toys, and personal items. The walls were covered with scratches and marks that appeared to have been made by young fingernails. More importantly, they found records. Billy Garrett had been meticulous in his documentation, keeping detailed logs of his inventory and transactions. The records showed that he'd been buying children from suppliers like David Allen Kovac and selling them to buyers across the United States and internationally. The names in Garrett's records corresponded with several of the missing children from the Six Flags cases. Sarah Williams was listed as product number 47, acquired on June 16, 1990, and sold on June 23, 1990, to a buyer identified only as Client 15. The entry noted that Sarah was, quote, blonde, 8 years old, good condition, minor bruising. Morrison had to step outside and take deep breaths of the cool autumn air. The clinical language, the reduction of innocent children to commercial products, the casual notation of minor bruising. It was almost too much to process, but she forced herself to continue reading, knowing that these records might be the key to finding the missing children. The investigation into Billy Garrett's trafficking network revealed a sophisticated operation that had been active for more than 15 years. Garrett had worked with suppliers like Kovac who could provide children, and with buyers who included pedophiles, child labor operators, and even adoption agencies that didn't ask too many questions about the children's origins. The buyers were scattered across the country, with concentrations in Florida, California, and New York. Some were individuals who had purchased children for their own twisted purposes. Others were organizations that had used the children for labor or other forms of exploitation. Working with federal agencies and international partners, Morrison's team began the process of tracking down the buyers and attempting to locate the missing children. The work was complicated by the fact that many of the records were coded, using numbers and abbreviations instead of names and addresses. But gradually, patterns emerged. Client 15, who had purchased Sarah Williams, was identified as a man named Marcus Webb who had operated a series of boarding schools for troubled children in rural Florida. The schools had been shut down in 1995 after investigations revealed widespread abuse and neglect. Webb had died in 2008, but Morrison was able to track down several people who had worked at his schools. One former employee, a woman named Janet Patterson, agreed to speak with investigators about her experiences. "It was a horrible place," Patterson told Morrison during their interview. "The children were beaten, starved, forced to work long hours in dangerous conditions. Many of them had been there for years, and they'd given up hope of ever leaving. I tried to help them, but there were too many, and I was just one person." Patterson remembered Sarah Williams, though she'd known her by a different name. The girl had been brought to the school in June 1990, just days after her disappearance from Six Flags. She'd been traumatized, barely speaking, and had required extensive medical treatment for injuries that Patterson believed had been inflicted during her captivity. "She was such a brave little girl," Patterson said, tears streaming down her face. "She never stopped hoping that her parents would find her. She used to tell me about her birthday party, about how her mother had made her dress, and her father had taken time off work to be there. She said they'd be looking for her, and they'd never give up." Morrison felt her heart breaking. Linda Martinez had been right. She'd never given up looking for her daughter. But Sarah had been so close, yet so far away, suffering in a place that might as well have been on another planet. "What happened to her?" Morrison asked gently. Patterson's expression grew even more pained. "She was there for about 2 years, but she was getting older, and Webb preferred younger children. In 1992, when she was 10, she was transferred to another location. I don't know where she went, but I heard rumors that some of the older children were being moved to work on farms or in factories." The investigation continued, following the trail of records and witnesses across multiple states and decades. Slowly, the fates of some of the missing children began to emerge. Some had died in captivity, victims of abuse, neglect, or violence. Others had been moved repeatedly, sold and resold like property, their identities erased and their histories forgotten. But remarkably, some had survived. Working with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the FBI's Innocent Images National Initiative, Morrison's team identified several adults who had been missing children from the Six Flags cases. The first reunion was with Amy Chen, who had been 7 years old when she disappeared from Six Flags in 1989. Now 39 years old, she was living in Oregon under an assumed name, working as a nurse and raising 2 children of her own. She had no memory of her life before the abduction, but DNA testing confirmed her identity. The reunion with her father was emotional and difficult. Amy had been conditioned to fear men, and she struggled to accept that this stranger was her biological father. But with the help of specialized counselors and therapists, they began the slow process of rebuilding their relationship. "I always knew I was different," Amy told Morrison during one of their interviews. "I had nightmares, panic attacks, difficulty trusting people. I couldn't remember my childhood, but I knew something terrible had happened to me. Learning the truth has been both liberating and terrifying." The search for Sarah Williams continued, following leads across the country. The trail led from Florida to Georgia, then to North Carolina, where records suggested she'd been sold to a textile factory that used child labor. From there, she'd been moved to a farm in rural Virginia, and then to a series of private homes where she'd been held as a domestic servant. The breakthrough came in November 2024, when Morrison received a call from Detective Lisa Chen of the Richmond Police Department. Chen had been investigating a human trafficking case when she'd come across a woman who matched the description of Sarah Williams. "Her name is Sarah Mitchell now," Detective Chen told Morrison. "She's 38 years old, married with 3 children. She's been working as a teacher's aide in Richmond for the past 10 years. She has no memory of her life before age 12, but she fits the physical description and the timeline." The DNA test confirmed what Morrison had hoped and feared. Sarah Mitchell was indeed Sarah Williams, the little girl who had disappeared from her birthday party 34 years earlier. The reunion with her mother was scheduled for a cold December morning in Richmond, with counselors and therapists standing by to help both women navigate the emotional reunion. Linda Martinez flew to Richmond with her husband and her 2 other children, who had been born after Sarah's disappearance. She was 65 years old now, her hair completely gray, her hands shaking with arthritis and anticipation. She'd waited 34 years for this moment, and she wasn't sure she was ready for it. Sarah Mitchell was a petite woman with blonde hair and blue eyes, the gap in her teeth long since corrected by orthodontics. She lived in a suburban neighborhood with her husband and 3 children, leading what appeared to be a normal, stable life. But the years of abuse and trauma had left their mark, and she struggled with anxiety, depression, and trust issues. The reunion took place in a conference room at the Richmond Police Department, with Dr. Patricia Hendricks and several other counselors present. Linda Martinez sat across from her daughter, studying her face for traces of the 8-year-old girl she'd lost so many years ago. "I know this is difficult," Dr. Hendricks said, addressing both women. "Sarah, your mother has been looking for you for 34 years. She never gave up hope that you were alive. And Linda, your daughter has built a life for herself despite everything she's been through. This is going to be a process, not a single moment." Sarah Mitchell spoke first, her voice soft but steady. "I don't remember you," she said to Linda. "I don't remember the birthday party, or the park, or anything from before. But I've always felt like something was missing from my life. I've had dreams about a woman with blonde hair who used to sing to me, 'Was that you?'" Linda Martinez broke down in tears. "I used to sing you to sleep every night," she said. "Your favorite song was 'You Are My Sunshine.' I still sing it sometimes, thinking about you." The reunion was emotional, but also awkward and difficult. Sarah had no memory of her early childhood, and Linda had idealized her missing daughter for decades. The reality of their reunion was complicated by the years of trauma and separation, and both women would need extensive counseling to rebuild their relationship. But it was also a moment of triumph. Sarah Williams had survived, had built a life for herself, had found love and happiness despite the horrific circumstances of her childhood. And Linda Martinez had been right to never give up hope. Her daughter had been alive all along, waiting to be found. The investigation into David Allen Kovac's crimes and the trafficking network that had exploited his victims continued for months after the reunions. Morrison's team worked with federal agencies and international partners to identify and arrest the remaining members of the network, though many had died or disappeared over the years. The hidden room beneath the Six Flags haunted house was preserved as evidence, though the theme park itself was demolished to make way for a shopping center. A small memorial was erected on the site, honoring the memory of the children who had been taken and celebrating the survivors who had been found. For Morrison, the case had been both the most difficult and most rewarding of her career. She'd seen the worst of human nature in the actions of David Allen Kovac and his associates, but she'd also seen the resilience of the human spirit in the survivors and families who had never given up hope. The case officially closed in March 2025, though Morrison knew that the ripple effects would continue for years to come. The survivors would continue their healing process, working with counselors and therapists to process their trauma and rebuild their lives. The families would continue to adjust to the new reality of their reunions, learning to love and trust again after decades of loss and grief. As Morrison cleaned out her case files and prepared for retirement, she reflected on the lessons she'd learned from the Sarah Williams case. Evil existed in the world, often hiding behind ordinary faces and normal lives. But goodness also existed, in the form of parents who never stopped looking for their children, investigators who never gave up on cold cases, and survivors who found the strength to rebuild their lives despite unimaginable trauma. The hidden room beneath the haunted house had revealed its secrets, but it had also revealed something else: the power of hope, the importance of truth, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Sarah Williams had been lost for 34 years, but she had never been forgotten. And in the end, love had found a way to bring her home. Sarah Mitchell continued to work with counselors to recover fragments of her early memories, and slowly, pieces of her childhood began to return. She remembered the pink dress with white flowers, the birthday cake with 8 candles, and the moment she'd made her wish before blowing them out. She'd wished to be a teacher when she grew up. And in a way, that wish had come true. Linda Martinez moved to Richmond to be closer to her daughter, and they began the slow process of building a relationship. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, misunderstandings, and moments of overwhelming emotion. But they persevered, guided by the love that had never died and the hope that had never been extinguished. The case of the birthday party that vanished at Six Flags, Texas in 1990 had finally been solved, but its impact would last for generations. It had shown that even in the darkest circumstances there was always hope. Even when all seemed lost, there was always the possibility of redemption. And even when evil seemed to triumph, there were always people willing to fight for justice and truth. The hidden room was gone now, demolished along with the haunted house that had concealed it. But the lessons it had taught would endure: that every child deserves protection, that every family deserves answers, and that no one should ever have to face their nightmares alone. In the end, that was the most important truth of all.